In this afternoon, we're supposed to have a PhD candidates roundtable, but which will not only be a roundtable among us, but also with the rest of the participants. This roundtable is composed of it's a combination of jurists, political scientists, political philosopher, and sociologists. So, in this sense, it's a diverse table, more diverse than the previous one. And the other day, when we were preparing the table, because we were supposed to combine the work that we are doing in our PhD thesis with the topic of the workshop, we had some doubts with the topic of the workshop, which is Europe's ability to accommodate diversity. Because we had doubts on Europe as a model, we had doubts on the abilities within the European framework to manage diversity. We could figure some opportunities and usefulness of accommodation as a path to handle pluralism. And we had one thing for clear, that is the necessity to face the social and political challenges that raised by diversity within Europe, which is an issue that it has already been raised up in the morning session. And therefore, we will try to make some questions and open the debate for after our presentations. We will proceed in the following order. First, Tina Magazzini will make her presentation from multiculturalism to superdiversity, an overview of the approaches to the moving target of the politics of belonging and becoming. Then Giulia Di Carlo will talk about citizenship and political participation, migrants as active agents in Europe. Myself, I will talk about accepting diversity, religious minorities and the gap between recognized rights and effective implementation. Sayua Bilbao will talk about religions as an opportunity for the integration of immigrant people. And José Rainchaurbe will talk about reasonable accommodation as a way to handle religious diversity in the workplace. After that, we will just open the floor to the debate with the topics that we will expose on whatever you suggest. So thank you, and Tina.
Thank you. Hello. So thank you for the opportunity of being here and sharing thoughts on this topic. When this morning Eduardo was presenting this afternoon roundtable saying that most of us are advanced PhD students and some of us even already turned in the thesis, that is most definitely not my case, as I have only been here right now for 3 weeks. So if it's somewhat not as developed as it should be, please bear with me. And I actually have no real empirical data for you as of yet. So we thought that I could start with just giving kind of a general overview of what the literature is so far on multiculturalism and diversity and the likes in broad strokes. And I'm sure that given the public here, most of you might even be more familiar than I am with the topic, so feel free at any time to interrupt, ask questions, correct, suggest, and whatnot. So I really enjoyed this morning's presentations, and one of the things that came to mind actually was when presenting these 3 kind of accommodations of lifestyles and linguistic diversity and religion. It's 2 days ago, the Ministry for Interior in France came out with a declaration that he had already stated sometime in March or April, but kind of like reasserted that Roma lifestyles were clearly in confrontation with the French way of life. And obviously this community cannot be integrated, does not want to be integrated, and should not be integrated. And the only solution is to send these people back to the borders. Now, being Mr. Valls, himself born in Barcelona from Spanish parents, it came as somewhat ironic in a way. But it is reflective of a trend, I think, that is important to address, since we're talking of Europe's ability to accommodate diversity. And in this sense, when Gorka said that we had, as a group, some doubts on the terminology used, I think it's very important to tackle the wording and how, especially in policymaking, terminology is chosen and used, because it does have an important effect on the policies that actually are implemented. So for instance, is it really an issue of ability or of willingness, of political will? Because this is not to undermine ability. I think it's a huge challenge from a juridical, social technical point of view to accommodate diversity, but one of the main issue also is whether there is or not at a European and at a country level the political will to do so, as a first point. So in terms of what the choice of the term diversity, I am personally very happy with it, because I think that we have made huge progress, both academically, politically, and socially in the last half a century, from going to sort of stigmatizing minorities, be them ethnic or linguistic or religious, and trying to either assimilate them or marginalize them or contain them to some extent. Since the 60s, there has been this attempt to deal with minorities in different ways that initially we have gone from sort of a racial connotation to an ethnical one to this multiculturalism. Now, in the 90s, multiculturalism has been declared dead a number of times. And we have gone to internationalism, interculturalism, and now more recently to diversity and superdiversity. How this terminology is used, I would say that in general, this morning, Frederick already outlined interculturalism as this sort of intensive context, something that tries to not deny diversity while constructing some sort of common identity, as opposed to multiculturalism, which is thought as something that is a little bit more monolithical, that deals with communities as such, and does not address necessarily in depth exchange necessarily. But there also is different kinds of, we can separate between normative multiculturalism and constructive multiculturalism. So while normative multiculturalism is rooted more in a political project that is based on a culturalized interpretation of the public sphere, so it requires a very narrow conception of culture. Then there is a constructive multiculturalism, which instead is rooted in a mobile conception of cultures. So it kind of takes into account different context, situations, and possibly also layers of multiple identities. Now, with the concept of diversity, this has been, in a way, opened up even more, because the idea is that we are diverse not only in terms of ethnicity, but also of gender, religion, language, culture, and whatnot. And I think the most important contribution in the sense of determining diversity is that it questions diversity within the majority and not only of the minority towards the majority. So this morning, the idea when we were saying, well, we don't usually talk about diversity, we talk about migration. And who are these migrants? And in this regard, the idea that we can talk about diversity and superdiversity, it questions also what is the capacity of the majority to not only accommodate, but also go towards the minorities or to address them in ways that changes the structure of society. Because going back to the Roma issue, a lot of people ask, well, why is it that these people do not want to be integrated in society? Which, I mean, this opens a whole other Pandora box, what means to wanting to be integrated or how many obstacles integration and discriminations put there. But it's also what kind of society is offered to minorities, meaning, just as an example, I have been living in Hungary for the past year. And on the day of the memory of the Holocaust, the right-wing party Jobbik organized a demonstration, which was going through the old Jewish quarter and the area where the Roma live. And the demonstration was to be called Give Them Gas. Now, this is a party that has 15% of the votes in parliament right now and is growing and is about to make an agreement with the majority in government. So if it is to be part of this system, it's easy to understand why certain minorities feel alienated. But in general, the way that I understand it, this shift from multiculturalism to diversity brings about a shift in focus from entities, so a community as such, to relations. So we're not talking so much about migrants into Spain or into the Basque Country or into Europe, but also of mobility in general within Europe and on minority-majority relations that are more flex and open. The problem that some scholars in the literature have pointed to is that, for instance, this has a slight focus on the identity of the individual and less on the group, which means that whereas certain racial connotation or ethnic connotation or multicultural groups have been a very instrumental tool in terms of advancing some kind of quotas or political movements in some countries, this focus on diversity risks kind of homogenizing all diversities, making it that gender diversity is the same as immigration diversity, is the same as racial diversity, which is not always the case. But I think it's a huge challenge in the sense that the whole issue is a very broad one, and Europe as a unity does not have a one political stance. So when this morning also we were talking about, well, but then we have these directives at the EU level, but they're implemented and understood differently in each country, that is because, to the best of my knowledge, there is not one legal definition of minority, which has some very serious implications, meaning that in the case of the national Roma integration strategies, yes, there are certain areas that each country needs to tackle, but then the definition of which population is the target is the country itself. So there are certain, I'm sure like people that come from law background are perfectly aware that like in France, you cannot collect data based on ethnicity. So how do you address an issue where you do not know the numbers of the minorities that you would like to integrate? And what is integration in the first place? So I think I will leave the floor to the more advanced PhD students that will go a little bit more in depth on the religious aspect of this, but just with a little anecdote actually of a lady that I had interviewed some time ago, and this was in Hungary, and she was telling me the story of her mom, which was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and went to school in Czechoslovakia, and then she got married in Hungary, worked most of her life in the USSR, eventually died in Ukraine, and she had never moved from the city of Mukachevo. But just the borders changed. She hadn't. And she considered herself to be Jewish and Hungarian. And at one point she applied for Hungarian citizenship because she was sort of fed up. She had the USSR passport that wasn't valid, and the authorities asked her whether she considered herself to be a Hungarian Jew or a Jewish Hungarian, because Jews are considered to be a national minority in Hungary. So depending, it's not that she would be denied citizenship, but they just wanted to know whether they should collocate her in the national minority or not. So I think it's important to speak about diversity and identities, but also sometimes to go back to the roots and try to redefine what identity means and to really unpack this whole concept, which is multifaceted. Thanks.
Thank you, Tina. I already introduced me today. I'm Giulia Di Carlo, and I'm a PhD candidate. I already finished my PhD thesis, and I'm going to talk from a local level because my thesis is about the role of sub-Saharan immigrants associations and the role of the association in their socio-political integration in the host countries, specifically in the Basque Country and Sicily, and their relationship with the sending country with the case study of Guinea-Conakry. In my PhD thesis, I tried to answer several questions regarding immigrant socio-political integration, but today, according with the workshop theme, I address two specific questions. Do immigrant associations improve their socio-political participation in those countries, and do they facilitate access to citizenship rights? Specifically, I analyzed Sub-Saharan Immigrant Association in the Basque Country in Sicily, as I said, and I found that due to several factors, as the political fragmentation in the Basque Country and the lack of regional laws in Sicily, migrants and their organizations are marginalized, and they have to deal with a lot of difficulties. Due to those daily difficulties, Sub-Saharan associations are working to solve their community members' problems, but it doesn't seem sufficient to promote and boost socio-political integration of Sub-Saharan immigrants, both in Basque Country and Sicily. As a consequence, the conditions of immigrants are neglected and associations unstable, situation that is further aggravated by the current economic crisis, which also increase immigrant fluxes and the search for employment. To be brief, summing up, the political opportunity structure found in the Basque Country and Sicily needs a reassessment, in my opinion. Maybe starting from a new concept of citizenship that should allow a different access of Sub-Saharan people to socio-political rights, of which they have been deprived until now. To conclude, I already told that I was brief. I set out the need to establish local models to manage diversity. Maybe we should work at a micro level, starting from diversity and cohabitation in neighborhoods to promote different ways of living together. Thank you.
Well, in relation to this roundtable, I tried to bring up some of the findings of my thesis, no, relating with the topic of the seminar. The subject that I work in my thesis are religious minorities in the Basque Country and social recognition and public management of religious diversity. Before starting with those facts, well, this is for, I have to say some other things before just watching that, but it's, of course, well. I would like to say that when thinking on what to say about accommodating diversity, in this case, in relation to religious diversity in the Basque Country, I had several doubts with it. Because more than accommodating religious diversity or religious practices, what I find more appropriate to this context, to the Basque Country itself, is to refer to the acceptance of diversity itself as a part of the structural characteristics of any democracy, which is something that in the morning session has been raised. In the particular case of the case of a study, I mean the Basque Country, I find that the core issue of all this is the necessity of a real recognition and an effective implementation of rights related to freedom of religion, which most of them are already included in our normative framework. But first of all, let me show you just some facts about what are religious minorities, or what is when we are talking about religious minorities in the Basque Country, which will help visualize this reality. In general terms, there are almost 300 non-Catholic entities or communities in the Basque Country, most of which, over 90% of them, are part of one of the four main religions, of the following four main religions, which are Protestants, Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Orthodox Christians. The first two have specific rights included in the agreements that they signed with the Spanish state in 1992. Most of you already know. And the others, well, they have the normative framework of the Constitution and of the Religious Freedom Act of 1980. These non-Catholic entities have presence in more than 60 municipalities of the Basque Country and represent around 3% of the total population. Depending on different polls and different estimations, it would be between 2 and 4% of the population, of the total population of the Basque Country. There are communities that have been established for more than 40 years, and if we see this temporal sequence of the creation and establishment of communities of any of these religions, we could see that the line is a continuous increasing one. The graphic in the top is the one that shows from 1967, which is the first moment when religious entities which are not Catholic can register in the Ministry of Justice, and it goes just up all the way. The entities that are included in this graphic are entities that are still, alive, not entities that maybe they already closed or they went to another place. The graphic in the top is the sum of all of them, and the one in the bottom is one of the colors, which I cannot see from here, is the creation of the entity, and the other one is the registration. When the entities got registered in the official register of the Ministry of Justice. We can see that there are two peaks in 1992, the big one, and the other one is the last years. Most of the entities that were registered in 1992 are Jehovah's Witnesses worship places or communities, and Protestant ones. The other ones, the last ones, mostly are Muslims and Orthodox. On the other side, from a global perspective, the percentage of population identified with the Catholic Church in the last decades has gone significantly down. As we can see in this table, from different polls of the Centro de Investigaciones Sociológicas and also Sociometro from the Basque Country, I have established how each person auto-identifies in relation to their religion. And we can see that in the first data that we have in 1987, Catholics are almost 81% of the population, and in 2013, it's 57. There's a subcategory under this category of Catholics, which is practitioners and non-practitioners. Practitioners are much less than non-practitioners, but as I don't have the whole sequence, I only put this one. And we can see that there's a kind of a stabilization, in the last 3 years in other religions, between 4 and 5% of the total population. Well, going forward, and in relation to the specific aspects of religious minorities, in my thesis I have created a double entrance chart or table to analyze the outcomes of interviews carried out to leaders of religious minorities and representatives of and local public administration representatives in relation to two issues: the knowledge and the recognition, formal and legal, of religious minorities, and some of the main elements that I understand that are basic for religious practices. These elements have been identified in the basis of the normative framework as well as international standards regarding religious freedom. The 5 dimensions that I have identified is worship and worship places, organization and finance of religious communities, public or social projections of these communities, services in the sense of public services that the public administration has to offer or has to facilitate to the different religions, and everyday life issues. This information has been structured in 4 categories of demands and or necessities, and in relation to the difficulties of implementing these demands. The 4 categories are basic demands which are satisfied. These are basic demands to religious entities which are satisfied, which are already in the normative framework. Basic demands which are not satisfied. It's demands or elements that are basic for religious minorities and are inside the normative framework but are not satisfied. For example, here in Bilbao, what is happening with the mosques but with other religious communities, or what would happen. Specific demands that are satisfied, these are specific demands of some religious communities, the ones that have signed the agreements with the state, the 1992 agreements, specifically Protestants, Muslims, and Jews, but there are no Jewish communities in the Basque Country. And then specific demands that are conflictive. Some of them that can be understood as elements that should being accommodated, as for example, issues related to holidays or calendars. We will see that later with Josarra. And some other issues that are more conflictive, and there are different positions on accommodating these demands or not. For example, sanitary-related practices like circumcision or blood transfusion by the Jehovah's Witnesses. What I have observed from the analysis of the different interviews is that most of these demands, the 4 categories, suit into the normative and legal framework of the Spanish state in relation to freedom of religion. The Constitution, the Freedom of Religion Act of 1980, and the 1992 agreements. Even though, from the different casuistry that I have observed, sometimes some demands are satisfied and other times are not satisfied, as is the case with the worship places, indicating that there are some difficulties to implement effectively some of the recognized rights. To conclude, just some final considerations that I just will mention them in order to generate debate afterwards. Religion pluralism is a fact, basically through the presence of religious minorities, which is represented through a very small number. As we saw, it's between 2 and 4% of the population. Secularization, in terms of the decline of religiosity, seems to be widespread through society, but on the other side, institutional secularization has not been materialized completely. The religious entities want to be recognized as such, as religious entities, not as sociocultural or any other kind of entities. The main evidence is the will and the fact of being registered in the Minister of Justice registration of religious entities, and the adherence to central churches or federal entities, which are the ones that facilitate them to these specific rights that I mentioned before. And even though most of the religious entities in the Basque Country are registered and adhered to federal entities, they find serious difficulties when they try to establish institutional relations with public administration at local level, which affects their day-to-day life. There is a normative corpus that could almost fulfill completely the demands raised by religious minorities, but there are some difficulties in doing so. In certain part, in relation to the perception of religious entities as entities related to immigrant population, most worthy with the Muslims. And well, that would be more or less what I wanted to say. So thank you.
Hi, first of all, I apologize because I'm going to speak in Spanish. I'm not able, but for the next... pues a raíz de la tesis doctoral que estoy realizando sobre el capital social de las comunidades religiosas pertenecientes a 3 confesiones minoritarias en el País Vasco, que son la fe evangélica, el Islam y la fe ortodoxa, de todo lo que iba saliendo y sobre todo ligado a ese capital de vínculo, ¿no?, que se da dentro de las mismas comunidades, pues sí que salía un tema que creo que viene a coalición o al menos encaja bastante un poco en lo que estamos trabajando hoy aquí. Quería, ya mis compañeros, sobre todo Gorka, ha puesto un poco, ¿no?, de relieve, porque luego tiene importancia, ¿no?, un poco la realidad social que se vive en cuanto a las adscripciones religiosas en el País Vasco, y además ha traído los datos mucho más actualizados que los míos y corroboran un poco lo que quería decir, ¿no?, solamente por tener ese panorama de que, aunque todavía es una sociedad pues, culturalmente o sociológicamente católica, sí se aprecia pues es una disminución, ¿no?, un poco en las autodefiniciones religiosas, sobre todo a las personas. Yo traía más del sociómetro vasco del 2011, sobre todo entre las personas que se consideran católicas y católicas no practicantes, ¿no?, que llegan casi al 60%, ya están veo que en un 57%, bueno, pues que hay una disminución, aunque sabemos que todavía rige, ¿no?, en la sociedad, pues tanto en simbolismos, festejos, etcétera, estamos cargados de esa tradición, ¿no?, más católica. Pero sí que hay dos datos que un poco nos dan muestra de esa mayor diversidad, que sería el incremento de las personas que se definen como ateas o agnósticas y el de personas que pertenecen a otras confesiones religiosas que no es la católica, a esas que llamamos minorías, pero que también va creciendo, ¿no?, poco a poco el porcentaje. Y es aquí donde un poco entraría en este contexto pues un poco el análisis, ¿no?, del que voy a dar algunas claves. Bueno, pues sobre todo ese porcentaje, ¿no?, más de un 5%, pues esta nueva diversidad un poco se ve acentuada, digamos, por la llegada, ¿no?, de personas de otros países, bien, por un lado, de manera cuantitativa, incrementando el número de algunas comunidades religiosas, de confesiones que ya tenían esa presencia en el País Vasco, pero también de manera más cualitativa, pues creando esa presencia, ¿no?, de confesiones, de religiones que todavía pues no tenían esa presencia aquí. Y ahí, pues, dentro de las tres confesiones que he analizado, sería el tema de, pues, el caso de los musulmanes y de los ortodoxos. Bueno, en todas las entrevistas, en casi todas de ellas, es importante, ¿no?, cómo se subraya la importancia que la religión tiene en la vida de estas personas, ¿no? También encuestas como la de Ikuspegi 2007, que se hizo por áreas geográficas de procedencia de las personas, así como pues, la EPIE del 2010 que nos comentaba Arkaitz antes, pues también demuestran, y bueno, Pérez Agote, que a nivel estatal también ha sacado ahora un libro interesante respecto al tema, que el grado de religiosidad, hablamos un poco en genérico, ¿no?, porque no todas las personas, pero de la población inmigrante sí que es mayor que el de la autóctona o nativa, o llamemos como queramos, así como la centralidad, ¿no?, la importancia de la religión en la vida de estas personas. Digo, quería un poco enmarcar, porque en una sociedad en la que, bueno, ¿no?, pues, aunque no hay un declive real, ¿no?, de los datos, pero bueno, que ha pasado por unos procesos, unas etapas, procesos de secularización. De hecho, pues, este mismo autor un poco le da una de las razones a que esto sea así, pues un poco dice, tanto en España como en el País Vasco, pues un poco todos esos procesos de secularización vividos tan severos, ¿no?, que han marcado un poco en que esta realidad ahora se componga de esta manera, mientras que la gente, pues bueno, que igual ha venido de otros países en los que esta realidad no se ha dado, bueno, puede ser una de las razones de esta realidad. Lo cierto es, y con citas, pues eso, ¿no?, que llaman la atención, la importancia, ¿no?, la importancia que la religión tiene, y que, bueno, yo creo que tanto aquí en el País Vasco, tanto en el ámbito académico, hasta ahora, que ahora ya se van haciendo cosas, sobre todo desde el instituto pero y de esas administraciones, no es un tema al que se le ha dado ninguna importancia específica. Siempre se ha hablado de diversidad cultural en genérico, y, bueno, pues importante también tener en cuenta, ¿no? Y ahora el panorama ya nos está diciendo un poco también con las demandas, las normativas, pues que es una realidad a la que al menos hay que prestarle atención. Dicho todo ello, sí que mientras se hacía el análisis, pues salía el tema de la religión en general, pero en específico las comunidades religiosas como factor de integración de estas personas inmigrantes. Con una doble cara, las dos caras de la moneda, ¿no? La parte, los elementos que esto que ayudan, ¿no?, que posibilitan o facilitan en un primer momento al menos esta integración, y la parte negativa, digamos, elementos que quizá puedan obstaculizar esa integración o al menos no tan positivos. Respecto a los elementos que pueden facilitar, pues bueno, el tema del aporte necesario, ¿no?, de identidad. Como decíamos, es un tema muy, muy importante para muchas de estas personas, como parte indispensable, por lo tanto, de su identidad, sobre todo en las comunidades ortodoxas y las musulmanas, pues un poco el tema de comprender la religión y la cultura como un todo, ¿no? O sea, no se diferencian tan claramente esas esferas. Entonces, pues un poco se convierte la comunidad religiosa en este caso como un soporte, ¿no? Un espacio pues necesario en sus vidas, ¿no? Para que esa parte de la identidad tan importante pues bueno, no se pierda o no sufra alguna disfunción, digamos, ¿no? Por no llevarla a cabo pues de la manera que necesitan o que lo venían haciendo. Un segundo elemento también interesante es el tema del mantenimiento de la cultura de origen, ¿no? Las comunidades, bueno, una de las funciones que cumplen es la de conservar la cultura del país de origen. Y aquí, una vez más, pues el tema de la cultura y la fe, a veces de manera natural, ¿no? Se entremezclan. Y bueno, sí parece, ¿no?, que eso, pues cuanto mayor es la distancia cultural entre la propia y la sociedad de llegada o de destino donde se reside, pues que parece, como al menos al principio, más necesario, aunque sea de manera temporal, porque si no, igual no hablaríamos, no sé, también habría que hablar qué es integración o qué entendemos o cómo sería lo mejor, pero bueno, sí de manera temporal, pues un poco es el universo simbólico, digamos, que les da sentido, ¿no? En ese entorno que en un primer momento resulta hostil. Entonces, la comunidad en ese sentido pues le permite, ¿no?, mantener esa cultura. Para ello se desarrollan diferentes actividades, bien vinculadas al aprendizaje del idioma, de la historia o geografía del país de origen, y esto más hablando de las personas descendientes, ¿no? Vamos a hablar de segundas generaciones, pero sí, sobre todo los más jóvenes y las más jóvenes de las comunidades, pues a través de estas clases un poco recogen, ¿no?, ese mundo simbólico. Y no menos importante también, que hablaba un poco Gorka, el tema del festejo de las celebraciones importantes, ¿no? Vinculadas una vez más a religión, cultura, sin existir una línea muy clara. También, bueno, autores como Portes, ¿no?, le dan importancia a esto más allá del mero hecho religioso, por crear espacios de contacto entre miembros que quizá en otra situación no serían tan naturales o tan fáciles, ¿no?, de crear esas relaciones y esos vínculos. Bueno, un tercer elemento importante que sale también en casi todas, en algunas comunidades y confesiones, aquí se diferencia quizá con mayor capital humano, económico también, es el tema de la fuente de apoyo y ayuda, ¿no?, que representa la comunidad. Hacen una labor muy importante en este sentido, en la asistencia de servicios dirigidos tanto a personas que son parte de la comunidad como personas que se acercan, ¿no?, con necesidades. Y son varias las iniciativas también encaminadas a ello, como la ayuda a los recién llegados, para las personas que están en necesidades o apuros de carácter básico, y se canalizan también de muy diversas maneras, ¿no?, desde fondos destinados exclusivamente para este fin, el alojamiento en casas particulares o en espacios que ponen al uso, el reparto banco de alimentos y de ropa, y luego también, no menos importante, pues la labor de ofrecer información, ¿no?, tanto del entorno como de los recursos existentes, etcétera. Entonces, en este sentido sí que las comunidades religiosas juegan un papel fundamental en ese apoyo y ayuda, ¿no?, a las personas que realmente influye en la integración de las mismas. A través de estas iniciativas se genera como una solidaridad intragrupal, ¿no? Y bueno, esas comunidades se convierten en proveedoras de múltiples recursos. Hablamos igual más de las necesidades más materiales, pero también a otros niveles de escucha, resolución de conflictos, incluso también temas de búsqueda de empleo, etcétera. Bueno, y aquí esto ya es algo más propio, ¿no?, pero sí que un poco todo esto me llevaba a pensar, y pues al igual que otras entidades laicas, que en cierta manera estas comunidades un poco cumplen como con funciones del Estado, ¿no?, del estado de bienestar. O sea, es una labor ahí importante que bueno, que también luego repercutirá en las administraciones un poco el ver qué parte de ello, ¿no?, es necesaria y que quizá igual hasta se tendría que impulsar más desde otros ámbitos. Bien, otro de los elementos sería el tema de la convivencia en la diversidad. Pues muchas comunidades religiosas, ya como decía, son diversas en sí, ¿no? Muchos grupos, sobre todo evangélicos, donde hay mucha población que ha nacido en el País Vasco o en otras comunidades autónomas de España, donde bueno, comienzan ya hace unos años a llegar, sobre todo personas latinoamericanas, africanas. Pues bueno, también un poco lo digo frívolamente, como es un laboratorio, ¿no? También para las personas, un poco en esa convivencia de diversidad que tenemos a gran escala en la sociedad, ¿no? Y bueno, en general, bueno, si te dicen un poco de algunas comunidades, pues como que al principio, uff, ¿y esto cómo va a ser? ¿No? Los miedos que nos surgen, pues, ¿no? A todas y a todos, pero que en la práctica no hay grandes problemas en este sentido. De hecho, se ponen con el tema del idioma, también con las comunidades ortodoxas ocurre, ¿no? que por tema de distribución territorial o lo que sea, pues de algunas nacionalidades van a otras parroquias, de otra nacionalidad. Entonces, el tema del idioma a veces sí que ahí surge pues un multilingüismo que bueno, que gestionan bien, que intentan pues, buscar el idioma que puedan entender todas o todos, o van alternando, o sea que sí que se buscan mecanismos también de acomodo en ese sentido. Y bueno, y a mí, no sé, un poco en todo esto me recordaba, igual es un poco irse demasiado, ¿no? Pero sí, como con esto de los modelos teóricos de gestión de la diversidad, pues veía un poco aquí como un acercamiento como al interculturalismo, me parecía, ¿no? Porque era como que les recoge el elemento religioso, ¿no? Es un poco el que les une, y luego con toda la diversidad, ¿no? Que se mantiene dentro de las comunidades. Bueno, cosas que, esto no lo digo científicamente, pero sí que bueno, un poco se me iba ocurriendo. Y por último, otro trabajo importante, el tema y relacionado con la cohesión social, el trabajo de tender puentes con la sociedad. Y esto sí que sobre todo lo he visto en comunidades de fe musulmana, todo el trabajo, ¿no? Dirigido a crear estos puentes, ¿no? Y de sensibilizar a la población. Tiene su lógica, pues porque igual son las comunidades que mayor obstáculo perciben, ¿no? Y encuentran, pues bien por todo el tema de los prejuicios, los estereotipos, la mala prensa, temas más históricos, sociales, etcétera, pues bueno, sí que anhelan, ¿no? Poder un poco moldear ese imaginario negativo que existe, y bastantes actividades encaminadas a ello, en la que además, si en otras cosas no tanto, igual en esto sí que se apoya mucho a las comunidades musulmanas a través de visita a mezquitas, bien con vecindario, con el tema de Basurto, se acerca los vecinos, el ayuntamiento, bueno, pues como estas iniciativas que posibilitan un poco, ¿no? Ir abriendo vías al menos. Y aquí importante el protagonismo de los descendientes, porque muchos bien han nacido aquí y bueno, y otros han venido, pero que se han socializado aquí mayormente, y también pues todo ese bagaje también un poco les dota, ¿no? De unas capacidades para poder hacer esos trabajos de puente, mientras otras comunidades, igual de las primeras musulmanas más que llegaron a Eibar, pues todavía es gente mayor que quizás sigue más como en esos imaginarios, ¿no? Más anclados, no sé, ellos decían en palabras ellos mismos, bien, y por no ponerlo todo bonito, pues también los peligros, ¿no? Muy brevemente, o sea, los peligros, los elementos quizá más obstaculizadores para las comunidades y para estas personas, ¿no? Para ello, Coleman utiliza closure, ¿no? El término, y así como Olga Odgers, que es una mujer que me ha gustado mucho leerla, la verdad, trabaja todo el tema de las migraciones mexicanas a Estados Unidos, ella habla de la hiperintegración, ¿no? Que quizá esta hiperintegración, que a veces esta clausura de las comunidades que se produce, ayuda en un primer momento, digamos, a pasar ese mal bache o ese momento, ¿no? Inmediato de necesidad, pero que si se extiende en el tiempo, si se mantiene esa clausura, pues que puede ser obstaculizador, pues eso, ¿no? Para poder abrirse, para poder compartir y ser parte de la sociedad, ¿no? Creando un aislamiento hacia el interior. Y aquí también ella habla, importante, pues la capacidad que tienen las comunidades religiosas con lo que la fe supone para las personas de de manejar ese tema, ¿no? De hasta cuánto cerrar o hasta cuánto, pues un poco socializar y abrir y esta realidad, por supuesto, se retroalimenta con pues un poco lo que venía hablando también, que cuantas menos oportunidades tienes de participar en la sociedad como una igual o un igual, pues bueno, pues quizá es más fácil que este aislamiento, ¿no? Esta, mira, ahora me sale en euskera, joder, ¿vales? Que esta protección te, bueno, pues te ayuda, ¿no? Bien, y ya sí me paso un poco... Sí, quería hablar, y lo ha comentado Arcaich, pero bueno, ¿no? También en todo esto la importancia ahora con el tema de los centros de cultos, ¿no? Y que también es una estrategia, pues el querer implantarlas en sitios céntricos, pues también es como un guiño, ¿no? A la integración y cómo pues, con todo este tipo de normativas la nueva PGU pues, tampoco ayuda en nada, ¿no? O sea que hay también una labor un poco en las administraciones de ver, pues de tener en cuenta, ¿no? Lo que decía al principio, que ha sido un tema que se ha dejado ahí, como esto no es del ámbito público, ¿no? Según algunos, pues bueno. Y por último, el caso opuesto de estos más jóvenes y las y los más jóvenes, ¿no? Que en algunas comunidades sí que se preocupan pues, de haberse socializado entre dos aguas, digamos, un poco a veces les hace sentir perdidos, ¿no? Y en la interlocución con las administraciones, pues como ese estigma siempre de inmigrante, ¿no? de extranjera, decía sobre todo una mujer, ¿no? Yo he nacido aquí, yo soy musulmana y todavía ese estigma, ¿no? Y sobre todo, ya decía, por el tema pues, religioso, que una vez se junta todo, ¿no? Pero bueno, pues la otra cara de las dificultades que pueda generar. Y ya me callo porque me he comido un poco, creo.
Well, okay, hi. As an introduction, I have to say that my research topic is the same that the one that Sayo and Gorka are developing, which is religious diversity, but my background is law, so my approach to the topic is a legal one. Today, I'm focusing on a particular response to the challenge of how to deal with the religious accommodation demands in the workplace. And I'm focusing on the legal instrument that is called reasonable accommodation, as was understood in the United States and Canada. It, as you are fully aware, it was created in the context of a discrimination law in the workplace, and it's linked to the idea of substantive equality and linked as well to the indirect discrimination. In European law, there is no express recognition to the duty of accommodate for religious reasons. So the discussion about the eventual adoption or import of this figure to the European law is quite old. But my intention today is to share with you some considerations regarding a recent ruling of the European Court of Human Rights that was cited today, which is the case called Ueda and others versus the United Kingdom, because, as Frédéric Ast pointed out this morning, it's a turning point in the understanding of the court of how to interpret religious freedom when dealing with religious accommodation demands. And I have the feeling, and that's what I would like to discuss with you, that it might be a step forward. No, that's very well, maybe I'm too idealistic, but it could be a step forward in the adoption of a way of thinking that have some grounds in common with the rationale that is behind the reasonable accommodation. Well, it's what I will try to explain. As a previous consideration, when it comes to questions of religion or workplace accommodation requests face a dual legal framework in Europe. On the one hand, the European Union discrimination law, especially the Employment and Equality Directive, which prohibits direct and indirect discrimination. And on the other hand, the human rights approach through the rights and freedoms guaranteed by the European Convention. Both ways provide some grounds that could leave the door open for the adoption of a duty to accommodate. Regarding what I have called the human rights approach, it's true that the institutions of the European Convention of Human Rights have not been favorable to the establishment of a duty to accommodate on the grounds of religious freedom, in the Article 9 of the Convention, or on the grounds of religious freedom read in conjunction with Article 14. But I think that there are two exceptions, two ways inside the European Convention where we can find good starting points to find the emergence or the eventual emergence for the duty to accommodate. One is on a case law cited as well this morning. It's in the understanding of the court of the non-discrimination principle in Tlimenos versus Greece, where the court stated that the prohibition of discrimination established in the article was violated when a state failed to treat differently two persons who were in a different situation without an objective or proportionate, without objective or reasonable justification. And to avoid this discrimination, some states could be asked to introduce some, to modify some general rules and introduce some exceptions. And this recognition of the idea of indirect discrimination has not been later developed in relation to the freedom of religion. And a second way that I think it's stimulating as well is when it comes to analyze the limitation of a fundamental right. As all in liberal democracies, rights are not absolute, so freedom of religion can be limited, and it's foreseen in the Article 9.2 of the Convention, what it said that the freedom of religion could be limited when it's being prescribed by law and when it is necessary in a democratic society to achieve some legitimate aims. The use of this expression, necessary in a democratic society, implies, according to the European Court, the use of, to some extent, the use of a proportionality test. Because when certain norm or certain measure limits a fundamental right, it can only be considered proportionate and necessary in a democratic society if there are no alternative measures which are less invasive for the rights at stake that would allow the same ends to be achieved. That's the criteria of the court in the case of Glor versus Switzerland, which is not a case related to freedom of religion, but it's a case about disability and Article 5 read in conjunction with Article 14. But I think this criteria has not been adopted as a rule, for example, in the rulings related to the freedom of religion. And what I think the new perspective that we have in the Eweda case, well, there are 4 applicants in this demand, but I will focus on just the first of them, which is Lady Nadia Eweda. As has been pointed out this morning, she's a Coptic Christian, and she's been working in the check-in staff for British Airways in London Airport. And, well, she explained that she wanted to wear a cross over her British Airways uniform, and this demand was rejected because it was in breach with the British Airways corporative image, the uniform policy of British Airways. And Ms. Eweida claimed that the sanctions that she had suffered by her employer were in breach of the rights under Article 9 or Article 9 read in conjunction with Article 14. What it, as you have pointed out as well this morning, what it's stimulating from my point of view is that the tribunal rejects the use of the freedom to resign doctrine, which to some extent that was a sort of adulteration of the proportionality test need to use when you are dealing with these matters. I mean, because the freedom to resign doctrine that was used in Stedman versus United Kingdom and was cited as a precedent in Francesco Sessa, and in fact was used by the British government, saying that, well, since Mrs. Eweida was free to find an alternative employment without much inconvenience or undue hardship, this meant that there was no violation or not interference with her freedom of religion. And that's the argument that the court expressly rejects. And if you let me quote, because I think that the reasoning of the court is interesting. They say, given the, and I think you have written in your slide, because it's, given the importance in a democratic society of the freedom of religion, the court considers that where an individual complains of a restriction on freedom of religion in the workplace, rather than holding that the possibility of changing job would negate any interference with the right, the better approach would be to weigh that possibility in the overall balance when considering whether or not the restriction was proportionate. And that's, at the end, why her demand or her application is successful, because the court considers that there is not been a fair balance between the interest in conflict. And that's, well, as I said, quite stimulating, because in the traditional balance, the use of the freedom to resign doctrine meant that, in general, the business interests were prevailing without taking in consideration the actual facts of the conflict. And this time they are really making an interesting bet for adopting this balance or this balance approach. No? They have said, the court has reached the conclusion in the present case that a fair balance was not struck. On the one side of the scales was Ms. Eweida's desire to manifest her religious belief. As previously noted, this is a fundamental right because a healthy democratic society needs to tolerate and sustain pluralism and diversity, but also because of the value to an individual who has made religion a central tenet of his or her life, to be able to communicate that belief to others. On the other side of the scales was the employer's wish to protect a certain corporate image. The court considers that while this aim was undoubtedly legitimate, the domestic courts accorded it too much weight. And this is where the statement of the court is in connection with a very important aspect of the reasonable accommodation, which is a fair balance between the interest at the stake, and which was broken with the freedom to resign criteria. And well, another controversial point in the Eweida case comes when in the domestic court, the Court of Appeals, rejected Ms. Eweida's claim because she was claimed that she was victim of an indirect discrimination, and the Court of Appeals stated that this figure requires group disadvantage and evidence that other persons different from the applicant were put at a particular disadvantage. And so the Court of Appeal saw the wearing of a cross as Ms. Weira's personal choice and not as an actual religious obligation of her Christian faith. And this point of view is rejected as well by the European Court of Human Rights. With the reasoning, the court leaves the door open to the protection of more individualistic conceptions of, or more individualistic manifestations of religion, just as it happened in the Jakobski versus Poland case, or in the Supreme Courts of Canada ruling of Syndicate Northwest versus Amselem. And just the last quotation, when they say, it's when they make a definition of what manifestation is. In order to count as a manifestation within the meaning of Article 9, the act in question must be intimately linked to the religion or belief. An example would be an act of worship or devotion which forms part of the practice of a religion or belief in a generally recognized form. However, the manifestation of religion or belief is not limited to such acts. The existence of a sufficiently close and direct nexus between the act and the underlying belief must be determined on the facts of each case. In particular, there is no requirement on the applicant to establish that he or she acted in fulfillment of a duty mandated by the religion in question. So, the implications of the court, of the domestic court, the Court of Appeals, ruling were that there could be no indirect discrimination against a person who holds individual religious views that are not shared by others. And apparently, through the statement of the European Court of Human Rights, we can deduce that it's in the context of proportionality that the debate should take place, but not through the decision that indirect discrimination cannot happen to single adherents. And so they are, in my opinion, making a good step forward in terms of establishing a real trustful proportionality test.
Okay, thanks to everyone, to my mates for their exposition, and to you for your attention. To conclude the roundtable, we want to propose to address you some questions or socio-political concerns, if you like, to open the debate. Our main question is a European model to manage diversity possible? And unity in diversity. Diversity from whom and integration into what? Do we really need a European model to increase socio-political immigrant rights? Conditionalities of religions-state relation models in the management of religious diversity. Main challenges to recognize and accept diversity at political and social level. How to deal with the gaps between recognized rights and public opinion. The role of public opinion in a public administration in the management of religious diversity. And finally, is there room for the concept of reasonable accommodation for religious minorities in Europe? Let's open the debate.
Brief, just a few words. I mean, we all kind of agreed on I suggested the first questions to say a few words coming from and what I had in mind with this unity in diversity, which is the motto of the European Union, but it's also the motto of Indonesia, for instance. And it was already the motto of Indonesia when in the 80s and 90s they occupied East Timor and forced the assimilation of that country. So, I mean, how we use these expressions and this idea of diversity from whom, I was thinking of Kimlika's differentiation between different kinds of minorities. So he talks about, on the one hand, immigrants, on the other hand, of national minorities. But then we sort of have this blind spot of people that don't necessarily fit in either. African Americans in the US, Roma in Europe, Turkish workers in Germany, second generation immigrants, etc. So can we talk about one sort of policy, or do we need different policies and different indicators to measure it? Because I was looking at, there are a couple studies out there, all of them fairly recent, and there's one, the Multiculturalism Policy Index, which was compiled by the Queen's University in Canada, which is quite fascinating, and they put on the one hand immigrant communities, on the other indigenous populations, and yet another category is national minorities, and they kind of set different bars for integration and different requirements of these communities and how it's differently interpreted and how integration is achieved. So for instance, cultural national minority or non-territorial autonomy is considered a viable model for national minorities, but not for immigrants. And then there is the Measuring and Monitoring Immigrant Integration in Europe, which is a study that came out last year from the Netherlands Institute for Social Research, which also kind of sets integration as the goal, but then every single country decides how to define it and how to measure the indicators. So it's also interesting to look at different countries and how they differently measure integration. And then the Ljubljana guidelines that Eduardo was mentioning this morning that came out in November 2011, also I think they changed the title at one point. It was supposed to be the guidelines for multicultural societies, and then it became diverse societies. So there's also a lot of work behind, I think, these studies on how to go about what to pursue, as well as the Roma integration that after a huge debate that went on for months, decided to settle on the definition of explicit but not exclusive definition of minority, because they were afraid that by only addressing one singular community would actually be counterproductive. So in this sense, sorry for rambling on, but this diversity and integration, I really think that there have been so many models offered that sometimes the terms have really been used in contradictory ways. So I think that it should be the job of academics to sort of try to develop this understudied field a little bit more, and as to give less occasions in a way to politics to play with the terms as much as it has been done so far.
Me? Okay. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
it was the idea.
Okay, I think very brief. I think it's trying to ask, not trying to respond to the main question. I think it's not possible to create a European model to manage diversity, because Europe is really diverse. So it's, and also because the diversities, ethnic diversities, minority diversity, cultural diversity, religious diversity that they are in the different states members are really different. I mean, we are diverse, but our diversity is really different to the diversity in Germany, for example. The diversity from Germany, for example, you can understand if you look to the migration flows in 60s and 70s, but that it was like international migration, and this only taking into account this kind of migration flow, because I'm really, if someone from Germany can tell you more about the other migration flows that goes to Germany in past and whatever, no? And it's different to the migration process in South Europe,
Spain, Portugal, Greece, Italy, that we were like, we were the main reception territories in from the end of 90s, no? Because it was a change in the European migration flows, European migration model, no? So, and I think many times we like to make this kind of questions, like, okay, let's go to try to have the main challenge and to have one response. But I think, I don't know who has been that say, I think probably the management of the diversity comes from the micro level. And from the micro level and from the flexible models. From flexible model. I think not, we have a concept that is diversity, but diversity could have different characteristics. No? And we, first of all, we have to define about what kind of diversity we are talking about: cultural, religious, language. I mean, it's really complex, no? So I think it's better to try to generate models. Europe can give us a framework. Can give us a framework if we believe in the European project. I mean, like with what has the rights, law, the main framework. But I think the management, the model to manage the diversity, it has to be in a micro level. What's micro level in Europe? Could be a city, could be a country, could be a state, could be a province, I don't know. Could be a neighborhood, could be but I think it's better to go to this, because otherwise we can don't well or work. For example, that the discussion, well, the debate that we had before, one of the things that the policymakers don't do is ask to these ethnic minorities, okay, what is for you important in the integration process, for example, no? When they design the policies, no? So I don't know. I think this, for this reason, I think it's better not trying to create a one model, but to create more models that could be managed in a flexible mode in a micro level. I think that could be a way, and that could be also taking into account different kind of diversity. Probably it's not the same way that we are going to manage the cultural tensions in a neighborhood and in whatever city than religious diversity in another country. I mean, I think the responses are different. I think the tools are different, and I think the characteristics also are different.
I have a dream. Is that we are able to manage diversity in Europe, maybe not in a uniform way. The thing is that, yeah, maybe it's possible. Maybe we've got all the tools to do this European model, yeah, to fascinate it, to build it. I told you about the European Convention of Human Rights this morning. We've got all the rights, like the religion, the freedom of religion, the right to private life. We've got the right not to be discriminated against. We've got all these tools. The thing is that, as I showed you this morning, the court doesn't do much with these tools at the moment because of the lack of consensus, because of the specific role of the international judge in itself. And also because, yeah, this is a system which is a minimum standard of protection of human rights. Maybe the European Court of the EU has better tools. And to this point, that there haven't been so many cases in Luxembourg concerning the interpretation of the two directives that are about discrimination. Probably you've heard about these two directives that were taken in 2000. One is about racial discrimination in many, many fields, not only work and employment, but also housing, education, access to all kinds of private services and so on. And there is another one about employment, and that prohibits any kinds of discrimination in terms of religion, for example. So these two tools, I would say, legal tools, are quite interesting because the court, compared to the European Court of Human Rights, gives a uniform interpretation of EU law. So through these courts, maybe one day, one or two cases might reach this judge in order to ask whether reasonable accommodation in the workplace should work. And that would be quite interesting to have this point of view, because this won't be a minimum standard. It's going to be a common and uniform policy that would be applicable to all EU member states. But for the time being, we haven't had such cases, such challenges in Luxembourg. But maybe in the future we will have it. The question is not necessarily whether it is possible. It is possible if we want to, but is it really appropriate? Is it really appropriate? And I pretty much share your views. Is it should we have this policy, a top-down policy, or do we have another kind of policy on the ground in a flexible way, adapted to every cases? And probably this is something that would work much better. Actually, it works. It already works. It's just that I noticed that there is a kind of taboo about all these good practices that we can see in the ground. I had the opportunity to meet many employers who actually told me, well, I accommodate my employees who are Muslims, and during the Ramadan, it's normal, yeah, we accommodate working hours. Well, we find a way in hospital to bring specific food for patients. So all this kind of thing, it's like an under economy, but that already exists, actually. It's just that I think that politicians are quite reluctant to make all these good practices visible, yeah? So yeah, well, I still keep on the question whether it's appropriate at this level. I think that we're not completely ready for that. So it's a matter of fact. When I say we, I mean societies are their stand nowadays. They're not completely ready about it. So.
Anybody else? No reactions? And the rest of them?
I have two. The first regards this first question, unity in diversity, diversity from what? For me, the problem is that you cannot ask diversity from what? Diversity is a factual status, which means a plurality of elements. So you don't have diversity from what? In any case, you could say you are within diversity, but you are not diverse from something. Diversity is the ensemble thing, the global thing. So we are diverse means that we all live in a diversity situation. So I think there is a confusion with different from what. Because with the word difference, you could establish a comparison from something. The thing about difference, and we discussed this at the table before, is that difference and equality, and I'm sorry to be the analytical in this place, but difference and equality are proprieties of a comparison. So they are reciprocal. One of the proprieties of a comparison, of the difference, is that it is reciprocal. I am not more different from you than you are different from me. If we are different in the same measure. But what is important there is the standard of comparison. We are different according to what? If I'm different from Frederick, and she is different from me, if you take the standard of comparison, color of the hair. But we are different in the same measure. It means that we do not share the same characteristic. There is, though, in political discourse, a different concept, use of the word equality and difference, which is not comparative, which is valutative. And then when you say someone is different from other, it does not mean that you are making a comparison with a standard of comparison, but you are evaluating someone against the other. So when they say women are different from men, men are both an element of the comparison and the standard of comparison. And this is the use of difference from what? That we have to make explicit and combat. Because it is in that use of different from what in which you are saying that someone that is not equal to you is inferior to you, that it does not reach your standard, is in there that you create or that you hide inequality and power relations. So I think that we should be, and I agree with Tina, very careful when we use slogans like unity and diversity, because we are using them in very careless manners, and we do not pay attention to the power relations in the comparisons, which are the only thing that matters. The only thing that matters is the standard of comparison, which decides which are the categories that you think is important making, and what is the treatment that you would assign to those categories. And that is the only thing that matters in anti-discrimination law, in equality policies, in my opinion. And that's why I would go, the question then for me, it's not, the problem is not whether a model to manage diversity is possible. I would not focus on diversity, but on manage. That is the point. What does it mean, manage, and to manage diversity? Because it does not follow that to promote diversity is in itself good. If you have a situation of children education system, one is the Montessori system, and another one is beaten up children, with, like in the Christian cases in South Africa, and the other is, I don't know, the old Jesuit motto, la letra con la sangre entra, and many more like so. You have diversity, which doesn't mean that you should promote all of them just because you have many. So then the question goes to manage and not to diversity in itself, I would say. And the other thing is for Joserra is Eveida case. Eveida case is a fascinating case because it's a very paradoxical case. The Nadia Eveida, not the other three cases in Eveida. Because Nadia Eveida, and you have very wittily not say so, Nadia Eveida rejected reasonable accommodation. Nadia Eveida had worn the British Airways uniform for years. And then, when the blouse was changed, she said she wanted to show her cross pending on a necklace. And British Airways said, okay, we will initiate a procedure to say if this is possible. Would you, in the meantime, care to work in the administrative sector where you don't have any dressing code obligations? And she said, no. And then British Airways took 3 months to resolve her case, and she resolved it positively. So she said, we will adjust our uniforms to allow her to, and others to wear a visible cross in a necklace. But because the point was that she was wearing it in a necklace, whereas the uniform policy prohibited necklaces, not crosses, necklace. So she said no, and she went home. They took 3 months to resolve the case. She had worn the uniform for years. And then she went to Strasbourg, claiming to be a victim of indirect discrimination and lack of reasonable accommodation. And the fact is that in this case, you said you have to look for the proportionality test. I think the court did not make any effort to assess proportionality in this case. After Veda, what would you ask for in an employer for the rationality test in reasonable accommodation? British Airways took immediately her case on board, solved it in 3 months, and solved it positively for her. What else could have they done? Submit immediately to her request without any procedure to see it, saying, please do as you wish just because you said that this is your religion. From tomorrow you can do as you wish. What will be now the policy of an employer when he or she is faced with a request? Do they have to say, hands up? Now we have a Veda case. Here you also have the problem, 2 problems. Nadia Veda was a strategic litigation case. I mean, she might have been also quite headstrong by herself, but in this case, she rejected reasonable accommodation, as hard as reasonable accommodation might be to get in Europe. She rejected it because she was told to reject it by her lawyers because they wanted to raise another point. And these lawyers are the Alliance Fund, which are not fighting for uniform or reasonable accommodations, but for something very, very different. And the other problem in the Nadia Veda case is, in my opinion, that what the court was seeing is that they had to strike down the other 3 cases. So they had to give something. Otherwise, they would have been submerged by criticism. They would have been flown away with criticism. So they had to give something, and they gave in the less controversial case, which was Nadia Veda, because in the other case, the cross was a security issue, and the other 2 cases were about people asking to be allowed to discriminate against homosexuals. So, I mean, this is also part of the politics of law that one cannot simply ignore when reading a case. You read the whole situation. So to raise a Veda in the issues of reasonable accommodation is quite paradoxical. Is the result reasonable accommodation, or was what she was offered was reasonable accommodation and she rejected it? What would you say?
Now, my point with the Veda case is not to go to the fact, and that's why I already didn't mention it, because the debate I wanted to introduce was not about the specific fact of this lady, but to the fact that the European Court rejected this previous doctrine of freedom to resign. And that's what I wanted to point. Maybe I should have done it in an abstract, without mentioning, because I'm not interested, because I know I'm fully aware of what you said. But what I wanted to debate, to introduce with you, is the positive fact, from my point of view, is the rejection of this criteria, which was used previously, was part of the case law of the court in these cases, and the fact that it was rejected, so which is, I think, is positive in order to balance, to do a fair balance of interest at stake. And the second part was the consideration of indirect discrimination, if it was a matter of a single adherent or if it was a group discrimination. Those are the facts that I'm interested in. But you are right that the case has not only the facts of this lady around and the other three applicants, which makes the case more complex. But I wanted to focus on those two matters, which, in my opinion, could be interesting in future cases if really we remove this element of when we say that freedom to resign from your job is the ultimate guarantee of the freedom of religion. I mean, this I'm not. I don't agree with this statement, and the rejection of this statement, I think it's a step forward. I don't know where it is driving us, but this particular fact is interesting. And the second one is the fact that her claim was rejected because it was indirect discrimination. It's just group discrimination. It's not. It's another interesting debate that was part of the background of this case. That's why I just pointed out those two things in this case.
May I have a comment? If we come back to the etymology of diversity, because you started like introduction in what is the meaning of diversity and what we should diverse not from whom but from what, and to manage the standards, because we were in comparison with the standards. So you mentioned about diversity, like for me it was more like a philosophical concept about what is the meaning of diversity. But the idea is that diversity, it still persists between individuals because they have different experiences of life. So this, in this meaning, maybe diversity is that way of agree to differ, of European Commission conventions and policies and so on. So it's like the agreement to be different, the agreement to get into a new society and to be different, the agreement of this host society to be different from you, because
what does it mean to be different?
it's like my life experience is different from yours. It's not just about bodies.
I wouldn't quarrel that.
I mean, it's not just about...
Taken for granted.
From the perspective of human beings, we all are equal. This is for sure. There is no debate about this. It's like we are all the results of nature, or we have bodies and brains and like everything that we need to exist. But from the perspective of understanding, of behaving, of creating attitudes, values, visions, we are all different. Because we have, actually this is the real experiment, for example, because we all have our own opinions about some subjects, so, or about some cases presented by European courts. But this is not main discussion that I want to start. It's like, for me, I'm very curious about how to pursue within the European Convention to maintain this equality, because before it was like tolerance, and this was perceived in aggressive manner, because I am tolerated to those people who come in my country, who stay in my country, and I tolerate them. And after that appeared diversity. And what is next after diversity? I mean, what is the next level to, because to integrate and to make possible the cohesion, social cohesion between many representatives of Arab, Middle East, European countries or African countries, there is a huge step through the education, through the social policies integration, through the law policies integration, and so on and so on. So my main question is, what is next after the diversity? Maybe it's like difficult, but or it's too complex, but the meaning of what we are doing here, it's not just discussing. Maybe we are not changing the rules, but we can influence in the future something.
You ask what's after the diversity. I think there is nothing after the diversity. The diversity will exist. I mean, it's.
Some people talk already about the concept of super diversity.
Super diversity.
Yes, and then we would create hyper diversity.
I think the diversity is a situation.
Yeah,
It's a reality. It's a fact. So it's not. Diversity, I think, is from the beginning from the humanity, and diversity has been always. The thing is when we create the problem of the diversity. I mean, because diversity always has. And then when we think that diversity is a phenomenon that could create problems or something that we have to manage, opportunities or challenge, we make this kind of question. But imagine that we have these problems, but we manage and we solve the problems. But the diversity will maintain. The thing is that we will manage the situation and we create another reality. Probably the diversity will change, but diversity itself will stay.
There are some mechanisms to reduce diversity that have been used in history. Ethnic cleansing, for example, is a way of managing ethnic diversity. The problem is how to manage it in a democratic society, not to manage it in general, because diversity has always been managed.
From a legal point of view, diversity is not a legal concept at all. Yeah, it's just a matter of fact. What I know is minority rights. So minorities, you can try to define them legally speaking, even if lawyers are very reluctant to define them. Maybe what would come next to minority rights, I would say vulnerability rights, because this is a terminology that we start to find along case law of the European Court of Human Rights more and more. We used to see only minority rights, and now there is a shift to vulnerable groups, like Roma people are a vulnerable group, homosexuals are a vulnerable groups, disabled people are a vulnerable group. It's true that we are all equal or all different, depending on your standing point. But in a collective way of looking at things, yes, you've got minorities or you've got vulnerable groups. And in this sense, maybe what you said is a bit different if we have a collective, if we look at things in a collective way. Yeah, we are both different, but maybe redhead people have been stigmatized for years and years and years, and maybe in order to be really equal or in a substantive way, we need to make a differentiated treatment to certain people. So I don't know what's next, but you've got at least this new terminology that you will find to identify certain groups in Europe, not only about, it's not only about racial issues, but also disability or sexual orientation, but this is maybe what is next, I don't know.
Because first of all was like intercultural communication. After that was First of all was intercultural communication. After that was like cultural tolerance, multicultural tolerance, and after this tolerance came diversity. So it was like many steps which were made by European Court and European Convention to make people to understand that, okay, we have these target groups, we have those target groups, they have problems, how to make them a part of European Communion, or how to develop their responsibility in front of this society in which they live. And it was more like, but instead of that, I think that the basic element is the education, because without education of those people who will come, for example, from Turkey, there are a family which want to migrate in Germany or some other country, Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, and they do not have any, let's say, like course, class, workshop, seminar about what this society behave like. What is like their lifestyle, or it's.
In France, we actually have classes for that.
But I don't mean in France. I mean in those countries. I mean those countries which are outside of European Communion, in those base countries from which migrants came. This is what I mean.
It depends. If you want to go to Holland,
Dolores. Excuse me, I think there were some other words asked around here, so if you don't mind, we distribute a little bit also the debate, or finish. Yeah. Just remember that when you talk, please.
To open the
Yeah, well, I asked the floor because I wanted to bring three ideas or comments. I don't know. Maybe some of them are related to these semi-philosophical discussions. But one is related to one point you mentioned, Tina. It's not because of you. I mean, it's just a common opinion, I think, about multiculturalism and interculturalism and all this stuff. And I always say that multiculturalism has not to be seen as something monolithic, which was recognizing groups and empowering them only, because if we read the declaration of the government of Canada in 1971, which was the first country to be declared as multiculturalist, there were 3 principles, and the third principle says fostering, promoting dialogue between groups and interaction. So I don't see, I know that is what is politically correct today, but I don't see what is the substantial difference between what we call now interculturalism and the democratic multiculturalism. And maybe we have to update, but I think the concept, I think, is more or less the same. The second point was, well, you put in your panel very big questions that it was impossible to answer all of them, but trying to say something minimum for that. To manage diversity, to my view, and I agree with the speakers that we cannot create a big model for all diversities, because diversity in itself is also diverse. And then we have to create like a kind of a network of models and solutions for managing diversities in a fair way, whatever it is that. That even if we divide the groups in indigenous or national minorities immigrants, etc. I don't think that works at all, because within each of these groups we will find, again, very, very diverse situations, because national minorities in Europe, I mean, it's not nothing to do, for instance, to be the South Tyroleans in Italy, or to be, well, Roma are considered national minorities by some countries, or to be the Turks living in Greece, for instance, because the conditions are so different that it's almost impossible to find a way of integrating them in the same, under the same party. So, but what I think is the minimum is the recognition of that. So that's a step which is necessary. It's not enough, but it's necessary. Without recognition, it cannot be management. And we have countries in the European Union, and this is one, and France is another one, whose official position is that they have no national minorities, they have no minorities inside. Without recognition, I mean, management is impossible. So we could say that at least there's a minimum, which is recognition, and then we will start discussing about how can we manage in a better way. And the third idea is that my feeling, this is not so scientific, but I mean, my feeling is that we suffer from a kind of an obsession about integration. So everything and everybody has to be integrated. And we have to create cohesionated societies, whatever it means. We have to integrate migrants, minorities, everybody has to be happy and integrated in a united Europe or whatever. And I think that's an obsession which doesn't fit very well with our liberal system. I think that the public space and the public whatever, the public sector has to offer a framework where it is possible to live in different ways and where it's possible to enjoy fundamental rights. And then we will have to discuss what are fundamental rights, what extent these European common values, they don't exist. We don't agree even on the right to life, so it's difficult to think in European common values. But I think that the public sector has to offer a framework, and then to integrate into the society, or to integrate myself, I think for each citizen and each group, it's a right, it's not an obligation. So sometimes we have the obsession of integrating others without integrating all people belonging to the us. If integration is so important, maybe we should forbid, I don't know, closed monasteries, for instance. I mean, we have the right to isolate ourselves in a liberal system. And I think we have to cope with that. We have to offer the possibilities of living together, but recognizing that individuals and groups can live separately if they want to. And I think in that sense, my feeling is that North American societies are more flexible to accept that than the European societies, which we always are looking for holistic solutions which never arrive. So that's, I would call this the obsession, integration obsession that we suffer from. That's all. Thank you.
A small comment about, I really agree about this obsession with the integration. The question is the society who has to be integrated. I mean, there is any problem about or any concern about the Japanese integration in Basque Country? Japanese people integration in Basque Country? There could be another immigrant collective that is here, but no, we think about people from Maghreb, people from, I mean, many times when we, integration has some focus collectives, and also looking to us, what's the integration degree of upper class people in our society? Living together, I think I never have been together with one people that is very rich.
Oh yes, you did.
And live in Neguri, for example. And it's from my home to 1,000 meters. This is another kind of, no, I think it's when we say, no, integration is needed, we need integration, but many times the thing is who has to be, or who we want to be integrated for the cohesion of our society, or how we see the society. No, so just wanted to do this remark.
Any other questions?
Just very briefly, I really appreciate it. I think it's good food for thought and good point taken on the diversity and different issue. And also, in general, I agree to some extent on the overlap of the multiculturalism, interculturalism debate, etc. And there is a very good, the last number of Identity by Berg and Sigona, in which it talks about identity and power relations, basically. And I think that one kind of red line that has gone across this whole debate, even if it's a little bit the taboo very often in integration debates and in non-discrimination, etc., is also this issue of power relations and of class. So like in this specific number, they try to integrate the integration debate with class debate as well. Because also in political science in general, class is one of those terms that has been declared dead over and over again, and I think to some extent it has been buried alive. So it's, I mean, the way that they look at it, it's diversity, they see it in three ways. One is as a narrative that can be used, for example, the UK, when they were trying to win the bid for the Olympics. It's something that has become very, very trendy to be very diverse as a community, as a city. So it can also be used politically to attract capital, etc. And then as a social fact, because just demographically from the 60s in which we were 3 billion, it's now more than double. So of course the level of complexity and of diversity in general, I mean, it's standards or non-standards, has increased and will continue to increase. And then as a social fact, and then as a policy, so how to manage this social cohesion, and do we need to be cohesive really? I'm not sure, but I think it's a healthy debate to start looking not only at ethnic or religious or linguistic, but at the combination of this with also economics in it. Just a few thoughts.
Okay. Thank you all.